Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome. Welcome to Brainwash Festival. I hope you had a good day so far. I'm really happy that you're all here for this program under the optimistic title, The End of Humanity. That you chose this for your Sunday afternoon. I'm really happy. But I think you made the right choice because it taps right into, I think, what's important at Brainwash Festival. To take a step back and look a bit at the historical aspects of where we are right now, to say something about where we are living in right now and what we might be able to do about it. So I think you chose the right program. My name is Tim Wagemakers and I'm going to be sitting here and I'm going to be talking to Luke Kemp, who's going to join us online. Just so you know the theatrics of this, I'm going to be looking at that screen and you're going to be looking at that screen. So then you know why I'm facing this way and Luke is going to be behind me, but I see him. It's not that I'm talking to him while he's behind my back. We're going to talk about his book, Goliath's Curse, which came out, and it's quite an amazing book because, well, it's actually a kind of retelling of history and of societal collapse and Goliaths, which you may be translating into empires. Luke Kemp shows how they are also historical anomalies, in the sense that through most of history, people have actually not been living with a Goliath. And also, he shows that our current Goliath, and we're going to be talking about what that is, the global capitalist market economy, is so powerful that it might lead to the end of humanity. It sounds like a bleak message, but in the book there's also quite some hope about what we might be able to do about this and how we can escape this predicament. Because, there's quite something at stake. I don't know about you, but if you look at the news, it's not hard to feel your fate in humanity sometimes slipping away. Wars, killing thousands of innocent civilians, autocrats tightening their grip on power, CEOs enriching themselves and shareholders at the expense of other people. It can sometimes feel as if we are witnessing the very worst of what humanity can be. And Luke reminds us in his book that most humans are not selfish nor cruel by nature, and for hundreds of thousands of years we lived as cooperative, egalitarian communities. And great empires and states that dominate our history books, and that goes from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia to the dynasties of China, are in fact the exception rather than the rule. But the question is, what can we do to dismantle the global Goliath we are in right now without destroying ourselves? And that's what I'm going to be talking about with Luke Kemp. At the end, there's also going to be room for questions, so bear with me, think about them already. And right now, let's dive right into it. Luke Kemp is a writer and researcher at the Center for Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University. He studies human geography, international relations and economics, and has taught on these subjects at the Australian National University. Please give him a round of applause. Luke Kemp. You could hear the applause, right?
I could.
Good. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us. You're currently in Cambridge right now. Right?
I am indeed. And yes, it's just as rainy as the Netherlands is, you'll be glad to know.
I think it's quite nice here, actually, right? It's a bit cold.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry to say, yeah. We're going to be talking about your book, and it really is an amazing read. But if we just start with explaining a little bit, if we're setting the scene, Goliath's Curse, what would in short be the Goliaths you are talking about? What does it mean to be talking about Goliaths?
A Goliath is a collection of dominance hierarchies. A dominance hierarchy being a situation in which a society is ranked with some people superior to others, and they take resources and impose rules on the rest of us. Those are quite recent, and they're what you usually would call civilization. When I first started researching the book, the natural question is, what is collapsing? And most people would say civilization. Yet when you look for a good definition of civilization, there are none. They tend to be really vague things like advanced culture, which is about as biased against indigenous people as it is capacious and vague. When you actually look at the very first civilizations across the world, they're marked by things like human sacrifice, large-scale inequality, chains of command with kings and commanders. Those are all essentially just dominance hierarchies. That's what we're looking at here. And I call them Goliath to echo back to the biblical tale of the Philistine warrior who was clad in Bronze Age armor and ruled through violence. So ruling through violence, intimidating size, but also surprisingly fragile and born of the Bronze Age. That is a Goliath. And it's not just simply the state of the empire.
Yeah.
Rome wasn't just the empire, but it was also the distinction between slave and master, man and woman, rich and poor. The collection of those is the Goliath.
Yeah, and how does it help us to understand? Because actually, your book is a retelling of history. It's a different way of looking at the stories that we've been telling ourselves for all these years. How does it help you, or what do you think it says about the story we have been telling ourselves?
One of the most pivotal things I say in the book is this idea of evolutionary backsliding, that we often see human history as being one long tale of progress. And yet, when you look at most of our history, we live as nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers. We are largely equal, democratic, and despite that, we actually seem to do pretty well. There's evidence of trade from all the way from the east coast to the west coast of Africa 120,000 years ago. We were sharing musical instruments, lithic tools, genes, and culture. What really happens once we start to pick up these Goliaths, once we start to organize ourselves into dominance hierarchies, is we start to look in many ways less uniquely human and much more like the harems of chimpanzees and gorillas.
Yeah, and at the same time, if we look at the Goliaths, then it's also the sort of presumption we have that when an empire collapses, that means that we're going to descend into chaos, right? And that there's going to be more inequality, but that's not always the case.
Precisely. Our views of collapse are inherently shaped by the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, with this idea that once you don't have the state or a king around, you don't have authority structures, people turn on each other in a scramble for resources. That just isn't true. It's not true when we look at modern day disasters, where people tend to respond very altruistically, pro-socially, and are very good at self-organizing. And it wasn't true of past collapses either. And quite to the contrary, sometimes things can strangely get better after a collapse. If we look at 1991, with the fall of the Barre regime in Somalia, one of the best cases of kind of modern day societal collapse, 10 years afterwards, everything looks slightly better in Somalia. Maternal mortality has dropped by 30%, infant mortality by 24%, and extreme poverty by 20%. And they're actually doing even better in comparison to their more stable neighbors. In some cases, you're just better off being under essentially local governments and local warlords than being under a very predatory, unequal state.
Yeah. But then it says something about who is writing history, right? Because you talk about the power balance, but also the people that have been writing the history of our societies tend to say that we need to strive for a sort of empire in order to ensure there's no chaos.
Precisely. So one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of the 1% view of history, that most of the writers throughout history haven't been employed by a very small number of people, usually kings and the rich. And similarly, most of the actual artifacts we have access to, things like palaces, temples, ziggurats, pyramids, they tend to be emblematic of a very small amount of people. Even at the very height of the Roman Empire, 95% of people lived on farms. And most of the way they lived was biodegradable. They were using things like wood, which don't pick up easily in the archaeological record. So we have a very distorted view of human history, one mainly from the eyes of elites, who are often the greatest victims of collapse. And it's quite easy to see how this can lead us astray. If you look at the Admonitions of Upwa, which is essentially from the very first collapse period, the first intermediate period of Egypt, those set of poems, they do talk about cannibalism and civil warfare, which we have no signs of either, but they also spend even more time talking about suddenly how the poor have access to their own tombs and sarcophagi, and basically you start to have the democratization of food. More people own and have access to food. That's not what usually people think about when they think of collapse. Yet for the later writers of Egypt, that was what they were most worried about, was actually the flipping of the social order.
Yeah. And if we turn to nowadays, then just before we start doing that, we need to maybe to dive a little bit into the term inequality, because that seems to be at the root of every collapse, or at least it's a very important aspect in why Goliaths collapse, right?
Precisely. So I call the book Goliath's Curse because the idea is that Goliaths contain the seeds of their own demise. Once you start to have these dominance hierarchies where power and wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few, it tends to kick off a cycle where, of course, if you're rich, you have the means to get richer. If you're powerful, you have more means to get more powerful over time. And that's what tends to happen. In general, wealth inequality tends to increase perpetually until you have something like mass mobilization warfare, a bloody pandemic or revolution, or a state collapse. And In general, most of the states throughout history have been incredibly unequal. One study of 28 pre-modern empires found that the average rate of inequality was 75% towards the maximum level of inequality. The maximum level being where one individual takes all the surplus and leaves just enough people to survive and reproduce. And the key thing in here is that once you get a sufficient level of inequality, it tends to prove corrosive to society. In the book, I show many ways why that occurs, including that as you get more elites and the society becomes more top-heavy, they tend to battle it amongst each other. They tend to engage in more things like coups and civil wars. They tend to take more resources from the rest of us, basically causing a cost of living crisis for most people. It tends to lead to worse decision-making as you have a very large number of people who don't want to change the status quo despite impending disaster. And as they're all battling for status, they tend to push for more conquests, drain the state slowly, and also for more environmental degradation to pull more resources from the land. They're essentially got a whole bunch of knock-on effects that slowly hollow out the state until eventually it's knocked over by a combination of things like disease, invaders, and climatic change.
Yeah, and if you look at that discussion, I mean, you mentioned climate change, you mentioned inequality. These are all topics that are quite familiar right now if we try to analyze the situation we are in right now. And still there's something different, right? I mean, you talk in your book about a different kind of Goliath that is right now manifesting itself. What is that Goliath we are in right now?
Well, first of all, the dynamic is definitely similar. In the 1950s, we had this great compression where wealth inequality was shrunken across the world. It started rising again in the 1970s. And a few decades later, you start to get democratic backsliding. You have the shift towards the far right that we see across the OECD. So that's simply history repaying itself and states heading back to their usual historical norm. The global Goliath is different in a few ways. One is that it is now global. Empires of the past tended to be regional, local. Now we live in one global, embedded, gigantic Goliath. It's not just simply the fact that we all live in one capitalist global economy, even places like China are still part of the capitalist economy, but even our forms of information are shared. Everyone more or less uses the big tech platforms like Google. Pretty much all countries have very similar property rights laws. That's the reason we can trade capital. And they're all based upon either New York state law or British common law. The elites tend to be trained in the same places, often in Switzerland and the UK, like Cambridge, for instance. And our militaries and our states all look remarkably similar. Despite all the ways you could organize yourself as a society, we tend to end up with essentially tiered militaries, where the biggest powers have things like nuclear weapons, and of course, states in which you have to have one key representative who goes to the UN, for instance.
Yeah.
We basically have either presidents or prime ministers. So we all look very similar. That's because we all are part of one single global system of domination.
Yeah, and if we talk about that, what's then at stake? Because if you look historically at it, Goliath's collapse, sometimes it's not even that bad in the sense that there's a period. I mean, we used to say it's always the Black Plague that comes next to it, or the Dark Ages, but you prove quite convincingly that that's not always the case. And at the same time, the title of this program is The End of Humanity, so there's quite something at stake right now.
Yeah, in the book I talk about how, for instance, the Dark Ages were usually called dark because of the lack of written records we had. But when you actually look at things like bones, often during Dark Ages, including after the fall of Rome, people get taller and they have stronger bones with less trauma in their bones, less holes in their teeth. In short, they seem to be healthier. And that's not just because there was less people who had more resources. You even see the people outside of the Roman Empire were taller and healthier. So it wasn't always bad to have a collapse. I think that's changing into the future for a few reasons. One is we have access to worse weaponry. One bad thing that tends to happen with collapse is you do tend to have violence as groups of armed young men usually try to reestablish a power structure. Previously, we had handheld bronze and iron swords and axes. Now we have nuclear weapons and killer drones. Similarly, we're now much more dependent upon kind of elite infrastructure and global industrialized infrastructure than we ever have been. While previously people could very easily move back to farms or hunter-gathering, most of us cannot do so. And last but not least, states have just become much more beneficial. While it was pretty good for many people in Somalia for the state to collapse, it wouldn't be good if the state of Denmark or the Netherlands, for instance, collapsed. It actually provides a lot of public goods. So the entire equation has shifted, meaning collapse going into the future is likely to be a grim prospect and to have far greater costs.
Yeah. Maybe to understand a bit more, I mean, I was listening to an interview a few weeks ago with our NATO boss, Mark Rutte, and he was saying the 21st century is again going to be the American age, which is sort of sentence saying, if we talk about Goliaths, okay, who's going to be in charge, who's going to have the power? How do you look at that whole discussion? Because it seems like we're right now in a sort of geopolitical shift where people are saying, okay, who is picking up the phone in crisis, who is currently in charge?
I think it's easy to get distracted by just the question of who's in charge, which I think is less important than how does a person in charge come into power. And right now, what we have across the world is essentially the biggest military power tends to be the one who sets the standards for the world. And in the long term, I don't think that is a sustainable situation. As I say in the book, if you have arms races over the space of decades or centuries, combined with improving technology, where is that likely to end? We've gotten lucky at least a dozen times with nuclear weapons. We have about a dozen near misses, and some of those were sheer dumb luck. I wouldn't rely upon deterrence ensuring that we survive in the very long term. So ultimately, for me, it's less important who's a superpower hegemon and much more important to be solving things like arms races to ensure our long-term future.
Yeah, but then at the same time, if you look at what's going on right now, then this arms race is accelerating, right?
Absolutely. I think there's a problem, unfortunately, is that what I call Goliath traps, these different situations that these big dominance hierarchies tend to fall into, so races for resources, for instance, and races for arms, which interestingly, most people in laboratory settings and many communities throughout history don't tend to do. Those, unfortunately, are getting worse. And yeah, all the signs don't look good right now, to be frank.
Yeah, but I was reading your book and I was wondering that if you look at sort of old Goliaths, I mean, you sort of can see who is trying to keep it in place. If you look at the Roman Empire, there is a sort of hierarchical structure where you can see someone at the top. And at the same time, if you look right now at what's going on in Silicon Valley, but also in governments or around the globe, it seems to be that it's more fractured, right? That there are more people sort of building up the strength of the Goliath, but no one is entirely sure where the head of it is.
I think it's always been complex and it's always been close to a hydra of multiple heads. Even in the case of Rome, yes, you did have an emperor, but there were usually multiple contesting claimants to the throne. And those usually had their own private backers and donors. And the fall of Rome in many ways was a story about rich families competing for greater power through the empire. It's a story of state capture. We see the same thing today as well. And you can still point to certain people who have outsized power and the ability to more or less dictate the overall trajectory of the empire and of the Goliath. So ultimately, we can still point towards people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Donald Trump, Putin. They may not have all the power, but they do have enough to really play a pivotal role in how things are unfolding. And in some cases, like with Trump, I'd say he actually has far more power than realistically any Roman emperor has. Bear in mind that Trump has the ability, with one decision, to launch the entire nuclear arsenal of the US, in the process potentially destroying the entire world. That's power that no one's ever had before, and that's the power to shape and end all of humanity.
Yeah, and that's why it also ties into your work with regard to existential risks, right? I mean, there are quite a few. Then you have nuclear power, you have AI, I would say. What are the other ones that you're concerned about?
Yeah, in general, when we talk about existential threats, we tend to have a small basket of these, including things like climate change, as you mentioned, advanced algorithms, AI, engineered pandemics, not just a natural one, but one that is engineered by humans to be particularly lethal and fast spreading. And we usually also chuck in nuclear weapons and sometimes some other ecological problems. And what's, I think, most concerning is if I was studying this, say, back in the 1950s, the only thing I'm worried about is nuclear weapons. Suddenly, a couple of decades later, I have an entire panoply of different threats to be concerned about. What I'm really interested in is not these individual threats, but rather what's the root causes that's driving us towards having these threats. And that's where I kind of trace them back to things like arms races, races for resources, which are these struggles that, again, only seem to happen to certain things, including, most importantly, these Goliath structures. And hence, I think in order to actually escape from the end of the world, if you will, we need to escape from these structures, first of all.
Yeah, maybe to dive into that, because it's also Sunday and we're going to be leaving people here outside the hall thinking, okay, what's next on Monday? But actually your book is also quite hopeful in the sense that there are ways to escape this predicament, right? So what are things that, well, might not make you optimistic yet, but that you think that's the way we should head, or we should go into?
Mm-hmm. In the book, I have a set of recommendations. The first ones are essentially, how do we reduce existential risk today? And those are pretty straightforward. We can, for instance, abolish nuclear weapons as a first step. We could minimize the stockpiles of countries around the world. Most studies suggest you only need somewhere around 200 to 300 nuclear weapons as a minimum deterrence. Basically, currently, the US has, 3,500, Russia has 4,000. First of all, get them to go down to those levels and eventually abolish them. Climate change, we know exactly what to do. We've had plans for decarbonisation for all major economies for years now. And in general, for most ecological problems and most big issues, we know what to do, which is we have to start making companies and others pay for the social and environmental damages their products and activities cause, which in many ways is just making the economy more honest. The big problem is, of course, we're always going to come back to, well, we can't do it because if we do it, China won't, for instance.
Yeah.
And this comes back to the question of arms races, races for resources. And the only way I think we're going to get out of those is by getting out of Goliath. And that means leveling different forms of power. In the book, I talk about different forms of power as control of information power, control of violence, violent power, control of resources, economic power, and control of decision-making, political power. And the book, I go through how we can basically level each of those forms of power. And the big ones to me are when it comes to resources and economic power, we can do some pretty simple things like start taxing wealth, put a cap on wealth of $10 million. Anything beyond that, no one really needs. They're just using it for status competition. And it's beyond those amounts that you start to get people trying to capture politics and by-elections, for instance. And if we're looking at democracy and politics, let's start using more things like citizen assemblies and citizens' juries. We have ample evidence at this stage they tend to work better and actually result in better outcomes. They tend to decrease polarization, increase legitimacy. And importantly, you start selecting at random for everyday people rather than selecting for people who actually want power and want status. In the book, this is a very quick example. I give the example of what I call the Trinity jury, which some of you may be familiar. In 1945, the US detonated the very first atomic weapon, known as the Trinity test. That was the end of the Manhattan Project. The Trinity test, the night beforehand, scientists were taking bets as to whether that would destroy the entire world. Since Edward Teller, one of the physicists, had made a calculation that there was a non-zero probability that igniting the bomb would ignite the entire atmosphere on Earth, killing every single life form. Not just human extinction, but the extinction of all life across the cosmos, potentially. By that time, we also knew the Nazis were no longer building their own bomb. So it wasn't about beating the Nazis to the bomb. And the question I pose in the book is, imagine if you randomly selected citizens from across the US, farmers, cleaners, nurses, and you gave them this information. You told them this weapon could potentially kill literally everyone, and we're no longer raising the Nazis. What decision do you think they would reach?
And the answer was?
The response from everyone I ever talk to, and the response from myself intuitively is, of course not. Like, there's no way they'll take that risk. And likewise, in the 1970s, when ExxonMobil knew about climate change and buried the information and spent tens of millions of dollars running misinformation campaigns, if you had a jury of citizens there, I don't think they'd say, yes, you're allowed to do that. So in general, I think one of the key ways forward is actually basically having more genuine real-time democracy. And luckily, we have both the evidence, the experiments, but also the technology to do democracy at scale now. And that's one of the things that gives me the greatest amount of confidence and hope about the future.
Yeah, but then at the same time, I sort of think, because in your book, you're quite optimistic about human nature in the sense that you think that people are willing to cooperate, they're willing to share, they have a sort of ethical compass that they're using. And at the same time, we sort of walk into the same Goliath trap every time.
Yeah, in the book, I do talk about how people are pretty decent. We're pretty altruistic. We seem pretty good. That's one of the reasons we survived the Ice Age, which was an incredibly difficult time to get through. It's because we were good at responding to disasters and relying upon each other. That being said, I don't think this is a story of humans being forever benevolent. That's pretty clear. Instead, I talk about the darker angels of our nature, that there's certain characteristics we have which are not evenly spread across the population, which tend to lead to the rise of these Goliath structures. And these include status competition. Everyone wants to be admired, respected, but only some people are willing to pursue that through violence, intimidation, and bullying. And those tend to be people who are also higher on the dark triad: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, a willingness to treat others as a means to an end. And generally speaking, what tended to happen was once you had these Goliath structures, the people who are willing to take power through violence were the ones who are most high in the dark triad and also the ones who are most intense in terms of status competition. In other words, we weren't selecting for the best of us to rule, which is pretty easy once you go looking through history. Most of the big names are essentially just serial killers. And I also talk about what I call power corrupting, that even when you get good people in charge, we have a large amount of psychological evidence suggesting that people, once they get into positions of power, tend to become less risk averse, more prone to cheating, both in their spouses and in games, less compassionate, less empathetic, and their brains actually change. They become less capable of mirroring, building a rapport through imitating others. And last but not least is that when people feel threatened, they're more likely to accept big authoritarian leaders and structures. It's what I call the authoritarian impulse. And it's why you tend to see people like Putin rising up during the Chechen bombings, and why people like Trump always emphasize the threat, whether it be of Venezuelan gangs or migrants. They always use some kind of threat to unify the people and to get them to accept authoritarianism. And that's something that's happened throughout history and is happening again today. But those four darker angels can explain much of the reason as to why we keep on ending up back in these structures. But with that knowledge, we can hopefully escape them.
Because if we look at the suggestions you have to get ourselves out of this trap and to maybe do something about that big Goliath we're in, you refer to democracy a lot and the way that we organize things. But at the same time, actually what you just explained are sort of authoritarian temptation that we are sort of not resistant against, makes it also quite difficult or a leap of faith maybe to think that we can change it, right? So where do you get your optimism? Or is it not optimism, but a sort of scenario thinking that you do?
It's always going to be scenario thinking. I don't try to give particular probabilities in the book because, as I mentioned, we can't really do that very well. Instead, I think about different trajectories that we're likely to end up. A doctor will not give you a precise number or probability of you getting cancer in the future, but they can tell you if you keep smoking, you're likely to get cancer. And similarly, in the book, I point out that I think it's most likely in the long term, we're heading towards self-termination, global societal collapse. I think in the short term, we're likely heading towards what I call Silicon Goliath, a world of more autocracy and more mass surveillance systems. And that's just right now the default we're doing. And the very final trajectory I see is what I call emancipation, or you can call it the David path, that essentially managed to slay Goliaths and create much more democratic systems. What gives me hope there is, as mentioned, our ability to actually look at the past and understand what's going on. I think once people can start to see the psychological quirks and understand that our systems are not selecting for the best of us, and our systems don't represent the best of us, then we're capable of changing them. There's no reason why in the book I talk about how if you took the US or Russia and boiled them down to a person, the United States government as a person would be horrible. They would be incredibly suspicious of everyone, bully even their closest neighbors and allies. They're constantly stockpiling weapons, and they give less than 1% of their money to the less needy. They're basically assholes, to be frank. And there's no reason our institutions have to be like that. That's just simply a historical anomaly due to the way we've selected leaders over time. And I think that knowledge can help us change things in the future. And importantly, as I mentioned, I think technology can also give us new ways to do things like democracy at scale. And in terms of overcoming that authoritarian impulse, one thing is you can often direct people towards a different kind of enemy. So rather than saying the problem is migrants, for instance, you can say, look, it's quite clear we're all having issues right now, something like a cost of living crisis. We all agree that democracy is not working. And the problem right now is actually much more elites and the rich. And the key thing is not decapitating them or doing a guillotine. It's just simply changing the structure and making sure all of us have a bit more power.
Yeah. And how do you look then at the discussion that is always going to be there in Europe? Like, we need a strong European Union. We need to make sure that as countries we work together more, which is also creating a sort of power structure that makes Europe stronger against, for example, China or America. How do you look at that discussion? Because you could say you're sort of creating your own mini Goliath to compete with the big one, or should you look at it differently?
It all depends on how the European Union is organized, of course. You can have a European Union which one king rules over all of Europe. You can have a system in which it's mainly done through citizen assemblies and juries, which basically scale up to a larger level. And right now, unfortunately, the European Union both has numerous members who are much more autocratic. And additionally, the way the bureaucracy is set up, it often does have a democratic deficit. But there's no reason it has to be that way.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, this is just a matter of basically putting our money where our mouth is. You know, when we talk about why Europe needs to stand up to Russia, it's usually in defense of freedom, democracy, etc. And yet, I think I'm pretty certain we spend at least 100 times more on facial recognition and mass surveillance than we do on improving democracy. It's about time we actually started more or less trying to become what we always envisioned ourselves to be, to actually become democratic and free. And in doing so, we just need to simply harness kind of all our scientific potential. But there's no reason that we can go to space, but we can't do democracy effectively at scale, including the European Union.
Yeah. Yeah. Does in that sense also the story of you saying that collapse doesn't always have to be bad in terms of our living condition also help us in sort of shaking away the fear that we need strong leaders and a sort of strong empire to make sure that we are safe? Because that's the word you always hear when we talk about the temptation for authoritarian leaders, that we say, okay, it always has to do with safety or an enemy that we need to confront.
Precisely. I mean, it's worthwhile bearing in mind, Europe before the European Union back 40,000 years ago, we already had a shared zone of cultural and technological trade called the Aurignacian, where you had things like figurines, arrowheads, etc., traded all the way from Siberia to Spain. We're capable of doing these things without having autocratic or authoritarian leaders. And the way I describe history is a story of organized crime, because when you look at the very first states, they basically look like organized protection rackets, crime rackets, in which a group gets in charge by having weapons that others don't have, things like handheld bronze axes and swords. The first states in the Near East and China, as well as Mesopotamia, don't pop up until you start to have Bronze Age weapons. And importantly, it always relies upon taking certain resources that are easily seen, stolen, and stored. It's not just simply having agriculture, but the first states only ever were states reliant upon resources like wheat, rice, and corn. Resources that you can easily see when they need to be harvested, you can store for decades, and you can basically monopolize them quite effectively. But the very clear image emerging is you start to have small groups of people who use violent means to basically take resources from others, and then probably justify it by saying, well, if we don't do it, someone else will, and you're better off trusting us. But ultimately, that's a protection racket. Like, the real threat is from those kinds of people. It's not from the outsider per se. Yeah.
You finish your book. Who would you like to I mean, if we start talking about people, who should read this book in the sense that you think that, okay, if they would understand a bit more about this, then we might get on the right trajectory a bit more?
I mean, ultimately, I hope most people read the book, insofar as it's easy to wish that one billionaire or a couple of really powerful people read it and try to change things. But when you look at the biggest, most successful points of progress we've had throughout human history, it tends to be through shared struggle. Back even in the 1920s and 30s, in the US, the reversal of inequality wasn't just because you had a bunch of really rich people saying, okay, we can accept more unionization. It was because unions were getting really effective at organizing, including organizing across ethnic divides. And that was one of the things that basically helped to push back fascism in places like the US. Likewise, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, decolonization movements across the world, they are all examples of shared struggle. And one thing I note in the book is that for most of human history, having technological progress did not make a difference to either real income or even to things like human height, human health in general. And even the Industrial Revolution didn't help. At first, people actually had worse life expectancies and got shorter after the Industrial Revolution. What changed was shared struggle. And ultimately, I just hope that Goliath's curse is hopefully some kind of resource people can use to push forward that struggle in the future.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's a great way to end this conversation and go to the audience. Maybe I can get a bit more light because I don't see anyone. Is there anyone who has a question to Luke or wants to know something? Then there is someone with a microphone coming towards you. Yeah, I think there's a microphone. Yeah. I think there was a question over there. Yeah. I think it's on already. You just need to... Does it work?
Test? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, hi. Well, thanks a lot. And we come from the previous talk that they were talking about fragmentation and also how that there's no one. It was about who leads the world, and the end conclusion I got, it was no one. And is that good? Is not good? I don't know. So, but I like that your hope or your idea about improving democracy, and you were talking about who reads that book. One of the things, and you said investing in democracy. One of the things that I see, and I would like your view on this, is how much the investment in education and related to democracy, reading the book and having critical thoughts and not becoming just followers can be linked to having a more hopeful future with democracy at the scale, or be more followers and just a bunch of elite in the power?
Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Education is critical, and it's notable that our classrooms right now are largely modeled on factories. They basically arose concurrently with factories and kind of having the really clear schedule and chain of command where you have one person in the front organizing others and managing them, basically. We're not really trying to encourage or teach our children to be good citizens. I know growing up in Australia, we basically got taught vanishingly little about either self-organizing in groups or even just the basics of how Australian parliamentary democracy works, or how to get information, for instance. We should be intentionally trying to train people to be both better citizens, but also be democratic, not just in terms of voting, but in their everyday lives. There's no reason why we should think of ourselves as a democracy if we vote once every 4 years, but we work 9 to 5 in dictatorships. Democracy, if we think it's something about people who have a collective stake in a collective project, should have a voice. Or if we think of democracy as being simply a better way of making decisions and holding people accountable, there's no reason that should be something that isn't done in places, both the workplace, but also in classrooms. So hence, yes, I think we need to basically change both education, but also wider culture in order to have that shift towards democracy.
Yeah. Any other questions or remarks? Yeah, there are two. There's one in the back, and then we come to you. Do you actually see the audience, Luke?
I do.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So I think it's very interesting to talk about researching different forms of democracy. We tend to view this as some kind of...
Can you put the mic a bit closer? Yeah.
Sorry. We tend to view this as some kind of development that is done. We implemented it. Now we only need to defend it. But I think it's actually something that needs to be actively researched. How can we improve it? And you emphasize this fact. I think one of the dangers I see here is the news, search engines, AI companies that have a big influence on social perception. So I think these are the major dangers moving forward. That will become more influential. How do we guard our democracies against these?
Good question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Obviously, living in an age of AI, information bubbles, and social media is not a healthy ecosystem for democracies to thrive. A few days ago, I was at a conference on the future democracy in Brussels. And interestingly, almost all the speakers seem to agree that we have most of the tools to actually address big tech. You know, we have antitrust rules, the GDPR, etc. And if those are effectively used, we could actually more or less control most of these companies and create a healthy ecosystem for democracy. The problem is they're not being properly implemented. And one of the issues there is simply that big tech has an incredible amount of lobbying power, both in Brussels, but also obviously in Washington, DC. And I think this is unfortunately the problem we have across the board, is that we often know what needs to be done, but unfortunately the people who profit from undermining democracy and creating existential risk, they do everything in their power to stop it from changing. I don't have any easy answers there, unfortunately. If I did, I'd probably be a far richer man doing a different job. But I think hopefully understanding that this is the problem, it's often a problem not of people not wanting to change or not supporting democracy, but rather companies actively lobbying against measures that would improve things. By understanding that, hopefully it helps us move forward.
But it's actually interesting that you're saying that, because then you're also saying that it can be a sort of deflection if we have political discussions about what needs to be done, because we know what needs to be done, but the implementation is where we're kind of hindered right now.
Yeah, so when I say, I guess when you say what needs to be done, you can both mean in terms of the actual policies, but you can also say what needs to be done in terms of the implementation. So how do we actually defeat the lobbyists at this stage and ensure we don't have so much lobbying and dark money in politics?
Yeah. There was a question at the front here. So then we go down once more. Yeah, over there.
Hi, I'm Lisa. Thank you so much for your talk. I was also wondering where to start, because you mentioned there's much more money going into improving mass surveillance than in improving democracy. And we have elections in a week, but it doesn't seem like this is a big topic in the public debate. So where do you think we can, or what is your expectation from, like, where should this boost come from? Is it like social movements? Is it protests? Should a philanthropist fund more experiments? Or should it come from political parties that apparently don't have it on their agenda yet?
Essentially all of the above, and it depends upon who's reading the book. If it's a philanthropist reading it, then yes, I'd like them to actually put their money towards things like doing more deliberative democratic experiments, trying to organize more social movements. If you don't have the position of being a philanthropist, then some of the best things you can do are things like voting, joining a social movement or a protest group, and of course, doing little things like writing to your MP and saying, why aren't you working more on reducing mass surveillance? Why aren't you encouraging more climate action, etc.? So it really depends upon who's reading the book, where they are. But in general, most of this is going to come down to political action, and I think in particular, social movements.
We have time for one more question. Is there anyone who can't sleep if they haven't? Oh, maybe we can make it two. If they're two short questions, then we start there and then we come to you if we have time left.
I will keep it short. Do you fear for society, because you say a collapse is actually good for society sometimes. Do you fear for a society like South Korea collapsing because they are declining in their population?
First of all, just as a clarification, while I think collapse was often a good thing in the past, I think it's more likely to be a grim thing in the future. In terms of fertility and collapse, I mean, essentially, we don't have any strong evidence that fertility is a strong factor which leads to collapse, at least not historically. And even going forward, it's pretty hard to see how a very slow-moving phenomenon like fertility, even if it creates, obviously, imbalances in the economy, can lead to kind of large-scale societal collapse. I personally see a lot of the fears around infertility kind of similar to some of the fears around migration, insofar as they're largely pushed by a small number of people in power, people like Elon Musk, as a way of basically putting forward their favoured policies. But at this stage, there's not much evidence that declining fertility rates are a key contributor or driver of collapse, particularly, obviously, at the global level.
Okay, we have time for the last question in the back.
Yeah, you gave some examples from the past as how unions or unionizations managed to change policies. Well, there's very big issues in the contemporary world, and we do see also some movements happening at this moment. So like the against climate change or against other parts, but somehow they don't really seem to have that effect yet. While anti-movements do seem to have effect, especially if they use violence as a means to an end. So is there a way, because you also said yourself, please join movements, but will that have an effect? Because somehow at this moment it doesn't have the effect yet.
Yes, obviously we have had examples like Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement in the US, which, while having some success, obviously like the traction of the Green New Deal in the US, just haven't had the level of success they need to have in order to change things properly. I think there's a couple of problems here. I think one is that, unfortunately, we live in a time where it's often more difficult to connect people. In the age of the 1920s and 30s, people were working side by side. They could easily understand their shared class interest. Today, when people are interacting through the internet, that's much harder. Additionally, when you're comfortable at home, it's much harder to want to go out to the streets. And on top of all that is, I think we've just not been very good at actually articulating an overall overarching vision for a movement. I think Bernie Sanders probably got the closest back in 2016. And personally, I think if Sanders wins the nomination, he probably beats Trump. But apart from that, no one's really been willing to craft a new vision for what the left is actually standing for. And even, for instance, here in the UK, a more left-wing government, Labour, are still pushing for mass surveillance measures and basically more or less have given in when it comes to immigration to the far right. In short, I think we need to find new ways of organising that make use of digital tools. And we also need to find a new vision for what the world looks like, not one that which is built around fortress nation states and kind of ethno-nationalism. I hope the book helps with that, but again, these are very tricky topics, and I'm unfortunately not a prophet who can answer all of them. But I do have hope that we can make social movements work even in the difficult times of today.
Yeah, and I think in your book there are some striking examples that say how social movements can work, and also across time what difference they can make. Thanks so much for all your questions from the audience. Luke, it was a real pleasure talking to you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I would like to thank everyone for being here, but I would especially like to give him a very warm round of applause, Luke Kemp, for this Q&A. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Tim, for hosting as well.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Luke. And I hope to see you at some other program tonight for Brainwash. See you later.